Section 33 of Irish Fairy Tales. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Ossine's Mother, Chapter 2. Late that night, when he was preparing for rest, the door of Fionne's chamber opened gently, and a young woman came into the room. The captain stared at her, as well he might, for he had never seen or imagined to see a woman so beautiful as this was. Indeed, she was not a woman, but a young girl, and her bearing was so gently noble, her look so modestly high, that the champion dared scarcely look at her, although he could not by any means have looked away. As she stood within the doorway, smiling, and shy as a flower, beautifully timid as a fawn, the chief communed with his heart. "She is the sky woman of the dawn," he said. "She is the light on the foam. She is white and odorous as an apple blossom. She smells of spice and honey. She is my beloved, beyond the women of the world. She shall never be taken from me." And that thought was delight and anguish to him. Delight because of such sweet prospect, anguish because it was not yet realized and might not be. As the dogs had looked at him on the chase with a look that he did not understand, so she looked at him, and in her regard there was a question that baffled him, and a statement which he could not follow. He spoke to her then, mastering his heart to do it. "I do not seem to know you," he said. "You do not know me indeed," she replied. "It is the more wonderful," he continued gently, "for I should know every person that is here. What do you require from me?" "I beg your protection, royal captain." "I give that to all," he answered. "Against whom do you desire protection?" "I am in terror of the Fear Dorshe." "The dark man of the She?" "He is my enemy," she said. "He is mine now," said Fionn. "Tell me your story." "My name is Saive, and I am a woman of fairy," she commenced. "In the She, many men gave me their love, but I gave my love to no man of my country." "That was not reasonable," the other chided with a blithe heart. "I was contented," she replied, "and what we do not want we do not lack. But if my love went anywhere, it went to a mortal, a man of the men of Ireland." "By my hand," said Fionn in mortal distress, "I marvel who that man can be." "He is known to you," she murmured. "I lived thus in the peace of Fairy, hearing often of my mortal champion, for the rumour of his great deeds had gone through the She, until a day came when the black magician of the men of God put his eye on me, and after that day, in whatever direction I looked, I saw his eye." She stopped at that, and the terror that was in her heart was on her face. "He is everywhere," she whispered. "He is in the bushes and on the hill. He looked up at me from the water, and he stared down on me from the sky. His voice commands out of the spaces, and it demands secretly in the heart. He is not here or there. He is in all places at all times. I cannot escape from him," she said, "and I am afraid." And at that she wept noiselessly and stared on Fionn. "He is my enemy," Fionn growled. "I name him as my enemy." "You will protect me," she implored. "Where I am, let him not come," said Fionn. "I also have knowledge. I am Fionn, the son of Uel, the son of Bashni, a man among men, and a god where the gods are. He asked me in marriage," she continued, "but my mind was full of my own dear hero, and I refused the dark man. That was your right, and I swear by my hand that if the man you desire is alive and unmarried, he shall marry you, or he will answer to me for the refusal." "He is not married," said Saive, "and you have small control over him. The chief frowned thoughtfully. "Except the High King and the kings, I have authority in this land." "What man has authority over himself?" said Saif. "Do you mean that I am the man you seek?" said Fionn. "It is to yourself I gave my love," she replied. "This is good news," Fionn cried joyfully. "For the moment you came through the door, I loved and desired you, and the thought that you wished for another man went into my heart like a sword." Indeed, Fionn loved Saif as he had not loved a woman before, and would never love one again. He loved her as he had never loved anything before. He could not bear to be away from her. When he saw her, he did not see the world, and when he saw the world without her, it was as though he saw nothing, or as if he looked on a prospect that was bleak and depressing. The belling of a stag had been music to Fionn, but when Saif spoke, that was sound enough for him. He had loved to hear the cuckoo calling in the spring from the tree that is highest in the hedge, or the blackbird's jolly whistle in an autumn bush, or the thin, sweet enchantment that comes to the mind when a lark thrills out of sight in the air, and the hushed fields listen to the song. But his wife's voice was sweeter to Fionn than the singing of a lark. She filled him with wonder and surmise. There was magic in the tips of her fingers. Her thin palm ravished him. Her slender foot set his heart beating. And whatever way her head moved, there came a new shape of beauty to her face. "She is always new," said Fionn. "She is always better than any other woman. She is always better than herself." He attended no more to the Fianna. He ceased to hunt. He did not listen to the songs of poets or the curious sayings of magicians, for all of these were in his wife, and something that was beyond these was in her also. "She is this world and the next one. She is completion," said Fionn. End of chapter 2. Section 34 of Irish Fairy Tales. Salt Lake City, Utah. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Ossine's Mother, Chapter 3. It happened that the men of Loch Lon came on an expedition against Ireland. A monstrous fleet rounded the bluffs of Ben Adair, and the Danes landed there to prepare an attack which would render them masters of the country. Fionn and the Fianna Fáin marched against them. He did not like the men of Loch Lon at any time, but this time he moved against them in wrath, for not only were they attacking Ireland, but they had come between him and the deepest joy his life had known. It was a hard fight, but a short one. The Loch Lonics were driven back to their ships, and within a week the only Danes remaining in Ireland were those that had been buried there. That finished, he left the victorious Fianna and returned swiftly to the plain of Allen, for he could not bear to be one unnecessary day parted from Saif. "You are not leaving us," exclaimed Gall MacMorna. "I must go," Fionn replied. "You will not desert the victory feast," Conan reproached him. "Stay with us, chief," Calta begged. "What is a feast without Fionn?" they complained. But he would not stay. "By my hand," he cried, "I must go. She will be looking for me from the window." "That will happen indeed," Gall admitted. "That will happen," cried Fionn, "and when she sees me far out on the plain, she will run through the great gate to meet me." "It would be the queer wife would neglect that run," Conan growled. "I shall hold her hand again," Fionn entrusted to Caelty's ear. "You will do that surely." "I shall look into her face," his lord insisted. But he saw that not even beloved Caelty understood the meaning of that, and he knew sadly and yet proudly that what he meant could not be explained by anyone and could not be comprehended by anyone. "You are in love, dear heart," said Caolte. "In love he is," Conan grumbled. "A cordial for women, a disease for men, a state of wretchedness." "Wretched in truth," the chief murmured. "Love makes us poor. We have not eyes enough to see all that is to be seen, nor hands enough to seize the tenth of all we want. When I look in her eyes, I am tormented, because I am not looking at her lips. And when I see her lips, my soul cries out, 'Look at her eyes! Look at her eyes!'" "That is how it happens," said Gaul rememberingly. "That way and no other," Caolte agreed. And the champions looked backwards in time on these lips and those, and knew their chief would go. When Fionn came in sight of the great keep, his blood and his feet quickened, and now and again he waved a spear in the air. "She does not see me yet," he thought mournfully. "She cannot see me yet," he amended, reproaching himself. But his mind was troubled, for he thought also, or he felt without thinking, that had the positions been changed, he would have seen her at twice the distance. "She thinks I have been unable to get away from the battle, or that I was forced to remain for the feast." And without thinking it, he thought that had the positions been changed, he would have known that nothing could retain the one that was absent. "Women," he said, "are shamefaced. They do not like to appear eager when others are observing them." But he knew that he would not have known if others were observing him, and that he would not have cared about it if he had known. And he knew that his Sahib would not have seen and would not have cared for any eyes than his. He gripped his spear on that reflection and ran as he had not run in his life, so that it was a panting, disheveled man that raced heavily through the gates of the great dun. Within the dun there was disorder. Servants were shouting to one another, and women were running to and fro aimlessly, wringing their hands and screaming. And when they saw the champion, those nearest to him ran away, and there was a general effort on the part of every person to get behind every other person. But Fionn caught the eye of his butler, Gareth Cronin, the rough buzzer, and held it. "Come you here," he said, and the rough buzzer came to him without a single buzz in his body. "Where is the flower of Allen?" his master demanded. "I do not know, master," the terrified servant replied. "You do not know?" said Fionn. "Tell what you do know." And the man told him this story. End of chapter 3. Section 35 of Ossine's Mother. Ossine's Mother, Chapter 4. When you had been away for a day, the guards were surprised. They were looking from the heights of the dun, and the flower of Allen was with them. She, for she had a quest's eye, called out that the master of the Fianna was coming over the ridges to the dun, and she ran from the keep to meet you. "It was not I," said Fionn. "It bore your shape," replied Gareth Cronin. "It had your armour and your face, and the dogs, Bran and Skeolan, were with it." "They were with me," said Fionn. "They seemed to be with it," said the servant humbly. "Tell us this tale," cried Fionn. "We were distrustful," the servant continued. "We had never known Fionn to return from a combat before it had been fought, and we knew you could not have reached Ben Idar or encountered the Loch Lennox, so we urged Our Lady to let us go out to meet you, but to remain herself in the dun." "It was good urging," Fionn assented. "She would not be advised," the servant wailed. "She cried to us, 'Let me go to meet my love.'" "Alas," said Fionn, "she cried on us, 'Let me go to meet my husband, the father of the child that is not born.'" Alas, groaned deep wounded Fionn, she ran towards your appearance, that had your arms stretched out to her. At that wise Fionn put his hand before his eyes, seeing all that happened. Tell on your tale, said he. She ran to those arms, and when she reached them, the figure lifted its hand. It touched her with a hazel rod, and while we looked, she disappeared. And where she had been, there was a fawn standing and shivering. The fawn turned and bounded toward the gate of the dun, but the hounds that were by flew after her. Fionn stared on him like a lost man. They took her by the throat, the shivering servant whispered. Ah, cried Fionn in a terrible voice, and they dragged her back to the figure that seemed to be Fionn. 3 times she broke away and came bounding to us, and 3 times the dogs took her by the throat and dragged her back. You stood to look, the chief snarled. No, master, we ran, but she vanished as we got to her. The great hounds vanished away, and that being, that seemed to be Fionn, disappeared with them. We were left in the rough grass, staring about us and at each other, and listening to the moan of the wind and the terror of our hearts. Forgive us, dear master, the servant cried, but the great captain made him no answer. He stood as though he were dumb and blind, and now and again he beat terribly on his breast with his closed fist, as though he would kill that within him which should be dead and could not die. He went so, beating on his breast, to his inner room in the dun, and was not seen again for the rest of that day, nor until the sun rose over Moy Life in the morning. End of chapter 4. Section 36 of Irish Fairy Tales. Salt Lake City, Utah. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Ossine's Mother, Chapter 5. For many years after that time, when he was not fighting against the enemies of Ireland, Fionn was searching and hunting through the length and breadth of the country in the hope that he might again chance on his lovely lady from the Shee. Through all that time he slept in misery each night, and he rose each day to grief. Whenever he hunted, he brought only the hounds that he trusted, Bron and Skeolan, Lomer, Broad, and Lomlu, for if a fawn was chased, each of these 5 great dogs would know if that was a fawn to be killed or one to be protected, and so there was small danger to Saive, and a small hope of finding her. Once, when 7 years had passed in fruitless search, Fionn and the chief nobles of the Fianna were hunting Ben Gulbane. All the hounds of the Fianna were out, for Fionn had now given up hope of encountering the Flower of Allen. As the hunt swept along the sides of the hill, there arose a great outcry of hounds from a narrow place high on the slope, and over all that uproar there came the savage baying of Fionn's own dogs. "What is this for?" said Fionn, and with his companions he pressed to the spot whence the noise came. "They are fighting all the hounds of the Fianna," cried a champion. And they were. The 5 wise hounds were in a circle, and were giving battle to 100 dogs at once. They were bristling and terrible, and each bite from those great keen jaws was woe to the beast that received it. Nor did they fight in silence as was their custom and training, but between each onslaught the great heads were uplifted, and they pealed loudly, mournfully, urgently for their master. "They are calling on me," he roared, and with that he ran, as he had only once before run, and the men who were nigh to him went racing as they would not have run for their lives. They came to the narrow place on the slope of the mountain, and they saw the 5 great hounds in a circle keeping off the other dogs, and in the middle of the ring a little boy was standing. He had long, beautiful hair, and he was naked. He was not daunted by the terrible combat and clamor of the hounds. He did not look at the hounds, but he stared like a young prince at Fionn and the champions as they rushed towards him, scattering the pack with the butts of their spears. When the fight was over, Bronn and Scialan ran whining to the little boy and licked his hands. "They do that to no one," said a bystander. "What new master is this they have found?" Fionn bent to the boy. "Tell me, my little prince and pulse, what your name is, and how you have come into the middle of a hunting pack, and why you are naked." But the boy did not understand the language of the men of Ireland. He put his hand into Fionn's, and the chief felt as if that little hand had been put into his heart. He lifted the lad to his great shoulder. "We have caught something on this hunt," said he to Caolte mac Roan. "We must bring this treasure home. You shall be one of the Fianna Fáin, my darling," he called upwards. The boy looked down on him, and in the noble trust and fearlessness of that regard, Fionn's heart melted away. "My little fawn," he said, and he remembered that other fawn. He set the boy between his knees and stared at him earnestly and long. "There is surely the same look," he said to his wakening heart. "That is the very eye of Saïv." The grief flooded out of his heart as at a stroke, and joy foamed into it in one great tide. He marched back, singing, to the encampment, and men saw once more the merry chief they had almost forgotten. End of chapter 5. Section 37 of Irish Fairy Tales. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Ossine's Mother. Chapter 6. Just as at one time he could not be parted from Saïv, so now he could not be separated from this boy. He had 1,000 names for him, each one more tender than the last. My fawn, my pulse, my secret little treasure. Or he would call him my music, my blossoming branch, my store in the heart, my soul. And the dogs were as wild for the boy as Fionn was. He could sit in safety among a pack that would have torn any man to pieces, and the reason was that Bronn and Scialan, with their 3 whelps, followed him about like shadows. When he was with the pack, these 5 were with him, and woeful indeed was the eye they turned on their comrades when these pushed too closely or were not properly humble. They thrashed the pack severally and collectively until every hound in Fionn's kennels knew that the little lad was their master, and that there was nothing in the world so sacred as he was. In no long time the 5 wise hounds could have given over their guardianship, so complete was the recognition of their young lord. But they did not so give over, for it was not love they gave the lad, but adoration. Fionn even may have been embarrassed by their too close attendance. If he had been able to do so, he might have spoken harshly to his dogs, but he could not. It was unthinkable that he should, and the boy might have spoken harshly to him if he had dared to do it. For this was the order of Fionn's affection. First there was the boy, next Bronn and Scialan with their 3 whelps, then Caolte mac Ronan, and from him down through the champions. He loved them all, but it was along that precedence his affections ran. The thorn that went into Bronn's foot ran into Fionn's also. The world knew it, and there was not a champion but admitted sorrowfully that there was reason for his love. Little by little the boy came to understand their speech and to speak it himself, and at last he was able to tell his story to Fionn. There were many blanks in the tale, for a young child does not remember very well. Deeds grow old in a day and are buried in a night. New memories come crowding on old ones, and one must learn to forget as well as to remember. A whole new life had come on this boy, a life that was instant and memorable, so that his present memories blended into and obscured the past, and he could not be quite sure if that which he told of had happened in this world or in the world he had left. End of chapter 6. Section 38 of Irish Fairy Tales. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Ossine's Mother. Chapter 7. I used to live, he said, in a wide, beautiful place. There were hills and valleys there, and woods and streams, but in whatever direction I went, I came always to a cliff, so tall it seemed to lean against the sky, and so straight that even a goat would not have imagined to climb it. I do not know of any such place, Fionn mused. There is no such place in Ireland, said Caolte, but in the Shee there is such a place. There is, in truth, said Fionn. I used to eat fruits and roots in the summer, the boy continued, but in the winter food was left for me in a cave. Was there no one with you? Fionn asked. No one but a deer that loved me, and that I loved. Ah me, cried Fionn in anguish. Tell me your tale, my son. A dark, stern man came often after us, and he used to speak with the deer. Sometimes he talked gently and softly and coaxingly, but at times again he would shout loudly and in a harsh, angry voice. But whatever way he talked, the deer would draw away from him in dread, and he always left her at last furiously. It is the dark magician of the men of God, cried Fionn despairingly. It is indeed, my soul, said Caolte. The last time I saw the deer, the child continued, the dark man was speaking to her. He spoke for a long time. He spoke gently and angrily, and gently and angrily, so that I thought he would never stop talking. But in the end he struck her with a hazel rod, so that she was forced to follow him when he went away. She was looking back at me all the time, and she was crying so bitterly that anyone would pity her. I tried to follow her also, but I could not move, and I cried after her too, with rage and grief, until I could see her no more, and hear her no more. Then I fell on the grass, my senses went away from me, and when I awoke, I was on the hill, in the middle of the hounds, where you found me. That was the boy whom the Fianna called Ossine, or the little fawn. He grew to be a great fighter afterwards, and he was the chief maker of poems in the world. But he was not yet finished with the Shee. He was to go back into Fairy when the time came, and to come thence again to tell these tales, for it was by him these tales were told. End of chapter 7. End of Ossine's Mother.
Section 39 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Wooing of Beckfola, Chapter 1. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Wooing of Beckfola, Chapter 1. We do not know where Beckfola came from, nor do we know for certain where she went to. We do not even know her real name, for the name Beckfola, dowerless or small-dowered, was given to her as a nickname. This only is certain, that she disappeared from the world we know of, and that she went to a realm where even conjecture may not follow her. It happened in the days when Dermot, son of the famous A of Slane, was monarch of all Ireland. He was unmarried, but he had many foster sons, princes from the 4 provinces, who were sent by their fathers as tokens of loyalty and affection to the Ard Righ, and his duties as a foster father were righteously acquitted. Among the young princes of his household there was one, Crimthan, son of A, king of Leinster, whom the High King preferred to the others over whom he held fatherly sway. Nor was this wonderful, for the lad loved him also, and was as eager and intelligent and modest as becomes a prince. The High King and Crimthan would often set out from Tara to hunt and hawk, sometimes unaccompanied even by a servant, and on these excursions the king imparted to his foster son his own wide knowledge of forest craft, and advised him generally as to the bearing and duties of a prince, the conduct of a court, and the care of a people. Dermot MacKay delighted in these solitary adventures, and when he could steal a day from policy and affairs, he would send word privily to Crimthan. The boy, having donned his hunting gear, would join the king at a place arranged between them, and then they ranged abroad as chance might direct. On one of these adventures, as they searched a flooded river to find the ford, they saw a solitary woman in a chariot driving from the west. "I wonder what that means," the king exclaimed thoughtfully. "Why should you wonder at a woman in a chariot?" his companion inquired, for Crimthan loved and would have knowledge. "Good my treasure," Dermot answered, "our minds are astonished when we see a woman able to drive a cow to pasture, for it has always seemed to us that they do not drive well." Crimthan absorbed instruction like a sponge and digested it as rapidly. "I think that is justly said," he agreed. "But," Dermot continued, "when we see a woman driving a chariot of 2 horses, then we are amazed indeed. When the machinery of anything is explained to us, we grow interested, and Crimthan became, by instruction, as astonished as the king was. "In good truth," said he, "the woman is driving 2 horses." "Had you not observed it before?" his master asked with kindly malice. "I had observed, but not noticed," the young man admitted. "Further," said the king, "surmise is aroused in us when we discover a woman far from a house, for you will have both observed and noticed that women are home dwellers, and that a house without a woman or a woman without a house are imperfect objects, and although they be but half observed, they are noticed on the double." "There is no doubting it," the prince answered from a knitted and thought-tormented brow. "We shall ask this woman for information about herself," said the king decidedly. "Let us do so," his ward agreed. "The King's Majesty uses the words we and us when referring to the King's Majesty," said Dermot, "but princes who do not yet rule territories must use another form of speech when referring to themselves." "I am very thoughtless," said Crimthan humbly. The king kissed him on both cheeks. "Indeed, my dear heart and my son, we are not scolding you, but you must try not to look so terribly thoughtful when you think. It is part of the art of a ruler." "I shall never master that hard art," lamented his fosterling. "We must all master it," Dermot replied. "We may think with our minds and with our tongues, but we should never think with our noses and with our eyebrows." The woman in the chariot had drawn nigh to the ford by which they were standing, and without pause she swung her steeds into the shallows, and came across the river in a tumult of foam and spray. "Does she not drive well?" cried Crimthan admiringly. "When you are older," the king counselled him, "you will admire that which is truly admirable, for although the driving is good, the lady is better." He continued with enthusiasm, "She is in truth a wonder of the world, and an endless delight to the eye." She was all that and more, and as she took the horses through the river and lifted them up the bank, her flying hair and parted lips and all the young strength and grace of her body went into the king's eye, and could not easily come out again. Nevertheless, it was upon his ward that the lady's gaze rested, and if the king could scarcely look away from her, she could, but only with an equal effort, look away from Crimthan. "Halt there!" cried the king. "Who should I halt for?" the lady demanded, halting all the same, as is the manner of women, who rebel against command and yet receive it. "Halt for Dermot." "There are Dermots and Dermots in this world," she quoted. "There is yet but one Ard Righ," the monarch answered. She then descended from her chariot and made her reverence. "I wish to know your name," said he. But at this demand the lady frowned and answered decidedly, "I do not wish to tell it." "I wish to know also where you come from and to what place you are going." "I do not wish to tell any of these things." Not to the king? I do not wish to tell them to anyone. Crimthan was scandalized. Lady, he pleaded, you will surely not withhold information from the Ard Righ. But the lady stared as royally on the High King as the High King did on her, and, whatever it was he saw in those lovely eyes, the king did not insist. He drew Crimthan apart, for he withheld no instruction from that lad. My heart, he said, we must always try to act wisely, and we should only insist on receiving answers to questions in which we are personally concerned. Crimthan imbibed all the justice of that remark. Thus, I do not really require to know this lady's name, nor do I care from what direction she comes. You do not? Crimthan asked. No, but what I do wish to know is, will she marry me? By my hand, that is a notable question, his companion stammered. It is a question that must be answered, the king cried triumphantly. But, he continued, to learn what woman she is, or where she comes from, might bring us torment as well as information. Who knows in what adventures the past has engaged her? And he stared for a profound moment on disturbing, sinister horizons, and Crimthan meditated there with him. The past is hers, he concluded, but the future is ours, and we shall only demand that which is pertinent to the future. He returned to the lady. We wish you to be our wife, he said, and he gazed on her benevolently and firmly and carefully when he said that, so that her regard could not stray otherwhere. Yet, even as he looked, a tear did well into those lovely eyes, and behind her brow a thought moved of the beautiful boy who was looking at her from the king's side. But when the High King of Ireland asks us to marry him, we do not refuse, for it is not a thing we shall be asked to do every day in the week, and there is no woman in the world but would love to rule it in Tara. No second tear crept on the lady's lashes, and with her hand in the king's hand, they paced together towards the palace, while behind them, in melancholy mood, Crimthan MacKay led the horses and the chariot. End of Chapter 1. Section 40 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, The Wooing of Beckfola, Chapter 2. They were married in a haste which equalled the king's desire, and as he did not again ask her name, and as she did not volunteer to give it, and as she brought no dowry to her husband and received none from him, she was called Beckfola the Dowerless. Time passed, and the king's happiness was as great as his expectation of it had promised, but on the part of Beckfola no similar tidings can be given. There are those whose happiness lies in ambition and station, and to such a one the fact of being queen to the High King of Ireland is a satisfaction at which desire is sated. But the mind of Beckfola was not of this temperate quality, and, lacking Crimthan, it seemed to her that she possessed nothing. For to her mind he was the sunlight in the sun, the brightness in the moonbeam, he was the savour and fruit and the taste in honey, and when she looked from Crimthan to the king she could not but consider that the right man was in the wrong place. She thought that crowned only with his curls, Crimthan MacKay was more nobly diademed than are the masters of the world, and she told him so. His terror on hearing this unexpected news was so great that he meditated immediate flight from Tara. But when a thing has been uttered once, it is easier said the second time, and on the third repetition it is patiently listened to. After no great delay, Crimthan MacKay agreed and arranged that he and Beckfola should fly from Tara, and it was part of their understanding that they should live happily ever after. One morning, when not even a bird was astir, the king felt that his dear companion was rising. He looked with one eye at the light that stole greyly through the window, and recognized that it could not in justice be called light. "There is not even a bird up," he murmured, and then to Beckfola, "What is the early rising for, dear heart?" "An engagement I have," she replied. "This is not a time for engagements," said the calm monarch. "Let it be so," she replied, and she dressed rapidly. "And what is the engagement?" he pursued. "Raiment that I left at a certain place and must have. 8 silken smocks embroidered with gold, 8 precious brooches of beaten gold, 3 diadems of pure gold." "At this hour," said the patient king, "the bed is better than the road." "Let it be so," she said. "And moreover," he continued, A Sunday journey brings bad luck." "Let the luck come that will come," she answered. "To keep a cat from cream or a woman from her gear is not work for a king," said the monarch severely. The Ardwi could look on all things with composure, and regard all beings with a tranquil eye, but it should be known that there was one deed entirely hateful to him, and he would punish its commission with the very last rigor. This was a transgression of the Sunday. During 6 days of the week all that could happen might happen, so far as Dermot was concerned, but on the 7th day nothing should happen at all if the High King could restrain it. Had it been possible, he would have tethered the birds to their own green branches on that day, and forbidden the clouds to pack the upper world with stir and color. These the king permitted, with a tight lip perhaps, but all else that came under his hand felt his control. It was his custom when he arose on the morn of Sunday to climb to the most elevated point of Tara, and gaze thence on every side, so that he might see if any fairies or people of the Sidhe were disporting themselves in his lordship, for he absolutely prohibited the usage of the earth to these beings on the Sunday, and woe's worth was it for the sweet being he discovered breaking his law. We do not know what ill he could do to the fairies, but during Dermot's reign the world said its prayers on Sunday, and the Sidhe folk stayed in their hills. It may be imagined, therefore, with what wrath he saw his wife's preparations for her journey. But although a king can do everything, what can a husband do? He rearranged himself for slumber. "I am no party to this untimely journey," he said angrily. "Let it be so," said Begfola. She left the palace with one maid, and as she crossed the doorway something happened to her, but by what means it happened would be hard to tell, for in the one pace she passed out of the palace and out of the world, and the second step she trod was in Fairy, but she did not know this. Her intention was to go to the Cloyne de Chalesh to meet Crimthan, but when she left the palace she did not remember Crimthan any more. To her eye and to the eye of her maid the world was as it always had been, and the landmarks they knew were about them. But the object for which they were traveling was different, although unknown, and the people they passed on the roads were unknown, and yet were people they knew. They set out southwards from Tara into the Duffery of Leinster, and after some time they came into wild country and went astray. At last Begfola halted, saying, "I do not know where we are." The maid replied that she also did not know. "Yet," said Begfola, "if we continue to walk straight on, we shall arrive somewhere." They went on, and the maid watered the road with her tears. Night drew on them, a grey chill, a grey silence, and they were enveloped in that chill and silence, and they began to go in expectation and terror, for they both knew and did not know that which they were bound for. As they toiled desolately up the rustling and whispering side of a low hill, the maid chanced to look back, and when she looked back she screamed and pointed, and clung to Begfola's arm. Begfola followed the pointing finger, and saw below a large black mass that moved jerkily forward. "Wolves!" cried the maid. "Run to the trees yonder," her mistress ordered. "We will climb them and sit among the branches." They ran then, the maid moaning and lamenting all the while. "I cannot climb a tree," she sobbed. "I shall be eaten by the wolves." And that was true. But her mistress climbed a tree, and drew by a hand's breadth from the rap and snap and slaver of those steel jaws. Then, sitting on a branch, she looked with angry woe at the straining and snarling horde below, seeing many a white fang in those grinning jowls, and the smouldering red blink of those leaping and prowling eyes. End of Chapter 2. Section 41 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, The Wooing of Begfola, Chapter 3. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, The Wooing of Begfola, Chapter 3. But after some time the moon arose, and the wolves went away, for their leader, a sagacious and crafty chief, declared that as long as they remained where they were, the lady would remain where she was, and so, with a hearty curse on trees, the troop departed. Begfola had pains in her legs from the way she had wrapped them about the branch, but there was no part of her that did not ache, for a lady does not sit with any ease upon a tree. For some time she did not care to come down from the branch. "Those wolves may return," she said, "for their chief is crafty and sagacious, and it is certain, from the look I caught in his eye as he departed, that he would rather taste of me than cat any woman he has met." She looked carefully in every direction to see if one might discover them in hiding. She looked closely and lingeringly at the shadows under distant trees to see if these shadows moved, and she listened on every wind to try if she could distinguish a yap or a yawn or a sneeze. But she saw or heard nothing, and little by little tranquillity crept into her mind, and she began to consider that a danger which is past is a danger that may be neglected. Yet ere she descended she looked again on the world of jet and silver that dozed about her, and she spied a red glimmer among distant trees. "There is no danger where there is light," she said, and she thereupon came from the tree and ran in the direction that she had noted. In a spot between 3 great oaks she came upon a man who was roasting a wild boar over a fire. She saluted this youth and sat beside him, but after the first glance and greeting he did not look at her again, nor did he speak. When the boar was cooked he ate of it, and she had her share. Then he arose from the fire and walked away among the trees. Begfola followed, feeling ruefully that something new to her experience had arrived. "For," she thought, "it is usual that young men should not speak to me now that I am the mate of a king, but it is very unusual that young men should not look at me." But if the young man did not look at her, she looked well at him, and what she saw pleased her so much that she had no time for further cogitation, for if Crimthan had been beautiful, this youth was 10 times more beautiful. The curls on Crimthan's head had been indeed as a benediction to the queen's eye, so that she had eaten the better and slept the sounder for seeing him. But the sight of this youth left her without the desire to eat, and as for sleep, she dreaded it. For if she closed an eye, she would be robbed of the one delight in time, which was to look at this young man, and not to cease looking at him while her eye could peer or her head could remain upright. They came to an inlet of the sea, all sweet and calm under the round, silver flooding moon, and the young man, with Begfola treading on his heel, stepped into a boat and rowed to a high-jutting, pleasant island. There they went inland towards a vast palace, in which there was no person but themselves alone, and there the young man went to sleep, while Begfola sat staring at him until the unavoidable peace pressed down her eyelids and she too slumbered. She was awakened in the morning by a great shout, "Come out, Flarn! Come out, my heart!" The young man leaped from his couch, girded on his harness, and strode out. 3 young men met him, each in battle harness, and these 4 advanced to meet 4 other men who awaited them at a little distance on the lawn. Then these 2 sets of 4 fought together with every warlike courtesy, but with every warlike severity, and at the end of that combat there was but 1 man standing, and the other 7 lay tossed in death. Begfola spoke to the youth. "Your combat has indeed been gallant," she said. "Alas," he replied, "if it has been a gallant deed, it has not been a good one, for my 3 brothers are dead, and my 4 nephews are dead." "Ah me!" cried Begfola, "why did you fight that fight?" "For the lordship of this island, the Isle of Fedach, son of Dali." But, although Begfola was moved and horrified by this battle, it was in another direction that her interest lay. Therefore she soon asked the question which lay next her heart. "Why would you not speak to me or look at me? Until I have won the kingship of this land from all claimants, I am no match for the mate of the High King of Ireland," he replied, and that reply was like balm to the heart of Begfola. "What shall I do?" she inquired radiantly. "Return to your home," he counseled. "I will escort you there with your maid, for she is not really dead, and when I have won my lordship, I will go seek you in Tara." "You will surely come," she insisted. "By my hand," quoth he, "I will come." These 3 returned then, and at the end of a day and a night, they saw far off the mighty roofs of Tara massed in the morning haze. The young man left them, and with many a backward look and with dragging, reluctant feet, Begfola crossed the threshold of the palace, wondering what she should say to Dermot and how she could account for an absence of 3 days' duration. End of Chapter 3. Section 42 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Wooing of Begfola, Chapter 4. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, The Wooing of Beckfola, Chapter 4. It was so early that not even a bird was awake, and the dull grey light that came from the atmosphere enlarged and made indistinct all that one looked at, and swathed all things in a cold and livid gloom. As she trod cautiously through dim corridors, Beckfola was glad that, saving the guards, no creature was astir, and that for some time yet she need account to no person for her movements. She was glad also of a respite which would enable her to settle into her home and draw about her the composure which women feel when they are surrounded by the walls of their houses, and can see about them the possessions which, by the fact of ownership, have become almost a part of their personality. Sundered from her belongings, no woman is tranquil. Her heart is not truly at ease, however her mind may function, so that under the broad sky or in the house of another she is not the competent, precise individual which she becomes when she sees again her household in order and her domestic requirements at her hand. Beckfola pushed the door of the king's sleeping chamber and entered noiselessly. Then she sat quietly in a seat, gazing on the recumbent monarch, and prepared to consider how she should advance to him when he awakened, and with what information she might stay his inquiries or reproaches. "I will reproach him," she thought. "I will call him a bad husband, and astonish him, and he will forget everything but his own alarm and indignation." But at that moment the king lifted his head from the pillow, and looked kindly at her. Her heart gave a great throb, and she prepared to speak at once and in great volume before he could formulate any question. But the king spoke first, and what he said so astonished her that the explanation and reproach with which her tongue was thrilling fled from it at a stroke, and she could only sit staring and bewildered and tongue-tied. "Well, my dear heart," said the king, "have you decided not to keep that engagement?" I, Beckfola stammered. "It is truly not an hour for engagements," Dermot insisted, "for not a bird of the birds has left his tree. And," he continued maliciously, "the light is such that you could not see an engagement even if you met one." Beckfola gasped, "A Sunday journey," he went on, "is a notorious bad journey. No good can come from it. You can get your smocks and diadems tomorrow. But at this hour a wise person leaves engagements to the bats and the staring owls and the round-eyed creatures that prowl and sniff in the dark. Come back to the warm bed, sweet woman, and set on your journey in the morning." Such a load of apprehension was lifted from Beckfola's heart that she instantly did as she had been commanded, and such a bewilderment had yet possession of her faculties that she could not think or utter a word on any subject. Yet the thought did come into her head as she stretched in the warm gloom that Crimthan the son of A must be now attending her at Clain de Chalech, and she thought of that young man as of something wonderful and very ridiculous, and the fact that he was waiting for her troubled her no more than if a sheep had been waiting for her, or a roadside bush. She fell asleep. End of Chapter 4. Section 43 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens, The Wooing of Beckfola, Chapter 5. In the morning, as they sat at breakfast, 4 clerics were announced, and when they entered, the king looked on them with stern disapproval. "What is the meaning of this journey on Sunday?" he demanded. A lank-jawed, thin-browed brother with uneasy, intertwining fingers and a deep-set, venomous eye was the spokesman of those 4. "Indeed," he said, and the fingers of his right hand strangled and did to death the fingers of his left hand. "Indeed, we have transgressed by order." "Explain that." "We have been sent to you hurriedly by our master, Melasius of Devonish." "A pious, a saintly man," the king interrupted, "and one who does not countenance transgressions of the Sunday." "We were ordered to tell you as follows," said the grim cleric, and he buried the fingers of his right hand in his left fist, so that one could not hope to see them resurrected again. "It was the duty of one of the brothers of Devonish," he continued, "to turn out the cattle this morning before the dawn of day, and that brother, while in his duty, saw 8 comely young men, who fought together." "On the morning of Sunday?" Dermot exploded. The cleric nodded with savage emphasis. "On the morning of this self-same and instant sacred day." "Tell on," said the king wrathfully. But terror gripped with sudden fingers at Beckfola's heart. "Do not tell horrid stories on the Sunday," she pleaded. "No good can come to anyone from such a tale." "Nay, this must be told, sweet lady," said the king, but the cleric stared at her glumly, forbiddingly, and resumed his story at a gesture. "Of these 8 men, 7 were killed." "They are in hell," the king said gloomily. "In hell they are," the cleric replied with enthusiasm. "And the one that was not killed? He is alive," that cleric responded. "He would be," the monarch assented. "Tell your tale." "Melasius had those 7 miscreants buried, and he took from their unhallowed necks, and from their lewd arms, and from their unblessed weapons, the load of 2 men in gold and silver treasure." "2 men's load," said Dermot thoughtfully. "That much," said the lean cleric, "no more, no less, and he has sent us to find out what part of that hellish treasure belongs to the brothers of Devonish, and how much is the property of the king." Beckfola again broke in, speaking graciously, regally, hastily. "Let those brothers have the entire of the treasure, for it is Sunday treasure, and as such it will bring no luck to anyone." The cleric again looked at her coldly, with a harsh-lidded, small-set, grey-eyed glare, and waited for the king's reply. Dermot pondered, shaking his head as to an argument on his left side, and then nodding it again as to an argument on his right. "It shall be done as this sweet queen advises. Let a reliquary be formed with cunning workmanship of that gold and silver, dated with my date and signed with my name, to be in memory of my grandmother, who gave birth to a lamb, to a salmon, and then to my father the Ardree. And, as to the treasure that remains over, a pastoral staff may be beaten from it in honor of Melasius, the pious man." "The story is not ended," said that glum, spike-chinned cleric. The king moved with jovial impatience. "If you continue it," he said, "it will surely come to an end sometime. A stone on a stone makes a house, dear heart, and a word on a word tells a tale." The cleric wrapped himself into himself and became lean and menacing. He whispered, "Besides the young man named Flan, who was not slain, there was another person present at the scene, and the combat, and the transgression of Sunday." "Who was that person?" said the alarmed monarch. The cleric spiked forward his chin, and then butted forward his brow. "It was the wife of the king," he shouted. "It was the woman called Beckfola. It was that woman," he roared, and he extended a lean, inflexible, unending first finger at the queen. "Dog," the king stammered, starting up. "If that be in truth a woman," the cleric screamed. "What do you mean?" the king demanded in wrath and terror. "Either she is a woman of this world to be punished, or she is a woman of the Sidhe to be banished. But this holy morning she was in the Sidhe, and her arms were about the neck of Flan." The king sank back into his chair, stupefied, gazing from one to the other, and then turned an unseeing, fear-dimmed eye towards Beckfola. "Is this true, my pulse?" he murmured. "It is true," Beckfola replied, and she became suddenly to the king's eye a whiteness and a stare. He pointed to the door. "Go to your engagement," he stammered. "Go to that Flan." "He is waiting for me," said Beckfola with proud shame, "and the thought that he should wait wrings my heart." She went out from the palace then. She went away from Tara, and in all Ireland and in the world of living men she was not seen again, and she was never heard of again. End of chapter 5. End of the wooing of Beckfola.
Section 44 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Little Brawl at Avon, Chapter 1. "I think," said Carol Whiteskin, "that although judgment was given against Fionn, it was Fionn had the rights of it." "He had 1100 killed," said Conan amiably, "and you may call that the rights of it if you like." "All the same," Carol began argumentatively, "and it was you that commenced it," Conan continued. "Ho, ho!" Carol cried. "Why, you are as much to blame as I am." "No," said Conan, "for you hit me first. And if we had not been separated," the other growled. "Separated," said Conan, with a grin that made his beard poke all around his face. "Yes, separated. If they had not come between us, I still think—" "Don't think out loud, dear heart, for you and I are at peace by law." "That is true," said Carol, "and a man must stick by a judgment. Come with me, my dear, and let us see how the youngsters are shaping in the school. One of them has rather a way with him as a swordsman." "No youngster is any good with a sword," Conan replied. "You're right there," said Carol. "It takes a good right man for that weapon." "Boys are good enough with slings," Confro continued. "But except for eating their fill and running away from a fight, you can't count on boys." The two bulky men turned towards the school of the Fianna. It happened that Fionn my Uel had summoned the gentlemen of the Fianna and their wives to a banquet. Everybody came, for a banquet given by Fionn was not a thing to be missed. There was Gol Mor Mac Morna and his people, Fionn's son Oisin, and his grandson Oscar. There was Dermot of the gay face, Caelty Mac Ronan, but indeed there were too many to be told of, for all the pillars of war and battle torches of the Gael were there. The banquet began. Fionn sat in the chief captain's seat in the middle of the fort, and facing him in the place of honor he placed the mirthful Gol Mac Morna, and from these, ranging on either side, the nobles of the Fianna took each the place that fitted his degree and patrimony. After good eating, good conversation. And after good conversation, sleep. That is the order of a banquet. So when each person had been served with food to the limit of desire, the butlers carried in shining and jeweled drinking horns, each having its tide of smooth, heady liquor. Then the young heroes grew merry and audacious, the ladies became gentle and kind, and the poets became wonders of knowledge and prophecy. Every eye beamed in that assembly, and on Fionn every eye was turned continually in the hope of a glance from the great, mild hero. Gal spoke to him across the table enthusiastically. "There is nothing wanting to this banquet, O chief," said he. And Fionn smiled back into that eye which seemed a well of tenderness and friendship. "Nothing is wanting," he replied, "but a well-shaped poem." A crier stood up then, holding in one hand a length of coarse iron links and in the other a chain of delicate antique silver. He shook the iron chain so that the servants and followers of the household should be silent, and he shook the silver one so that the nobles and poets should hearken also. Fergus, called True Lips, the poet of the Fianna Finn, then sang of Fionn and his ancestors and their deeds. When he had finished, Fionn and Oisin and Oscar and Mac Lugach of the Terrible Hand gave him rare and costly presents, so that every person wondered at their munificence, and even the poet, accustomed to the liberality of kings and princes, was astonished at his gifts. Fergus then turned to the side of Gol Mac Morna, and he sang of the forts, the destructions, the raids and the wooings of Clan Morna, and as the poems succeeded each other, Gal grew more and more jovial and contented. When the songs were finished, Gal turned in his seat. "Where is my runner?" he cried. He had a woman runner, a marvel for swiftness and trust. She stepped forward. "I am here, Royal Captain. Have you collected my tribute from Denmark? It is here." And with help, she laid beside him the load of 3 men of doubly refined gold. Out of this treasure, and from the treasure of rings and bracelets and torques that were with him, Gol Mac Morna paid Fergus for his songs, and much as Fionn had given, Gal gave twice as much. But as the banquet proceeded, Gal gave, whether it was to harpers or prophets or jugglers, more than anyone else gave, so that Fionn became displeased, and as the banquet proceeded he grew stern and silent. End of section 44. Section 45 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Little Brawl at Alham, Chapter 2. The wonderful gift-giving of Gal continued, and an uneasiness and embarrassment began to creep through the great banqueting hall. Gentlemen looked at each other questioningly, and then spoke again on indifferent matters, but only with half of their minds. The singers, the harpers, and jugglers submitted to that constraint, so that every person felt awkward, and no one knew what should be done or what would happen. And from that doubt, dullness came, with silence following on its heels. There's nothing more terrible than silence. Shame grows in that blank, or anger gathers there, and we must choose which of these is to be our master. That choice lay before Fionn. who never knew shame. Gal, said he, how long have you been taking tribute from the people of Lachlan? A long time now, said Gal, and he looked into an eye that was stern and unfriendly. I thought that my rent was the only one that people had to pay, Fionn continued. Your memory is at fault, said Gal. Let it be so, said Fionn. How did your tribute arise? Long ago, Fionn, in the days when your father forced war on me. Ah, said Fionn, when he raised the High King against me and banished me from Ireland. Continue, said Fionn, and he held Gal's eye under the great beetle of his brow. I went into England, said Gal, and your father followed me there. I went into White Lachlan, Norway, and took it. Your father banished me thence also. I know it, said Fionn. I went into the land of the Saxons, and your father chased me out of that land. And then in Lachlan, at the Battle of Kinnock, your father and I met at last, foot to foot, eye to eye. And there, Fionn. And there, Gal, and there I killed your father. Fionn sat rigid and unmoving, his face stony and terrible as the face of a monument carved on the side of a cliff. Tell all your tale, said he. At that battle I beat the Lachlannocs. I penetrated to the hold of the Danish king, and I took out of his dungeon the men who had lain there for a year and were awaiting their deaths. I liberated 15 prisoners, and one of them was Fionn. It is true, said Fionn. Gal's anger fled at the word. Do not be jealous of me, dear heart, for if I had twice the tribute, I would give it to you and to Ireland. But at the word jealous, the chief's anger revived. It is an impertinence, he cried, to boast at this table that you killed my father. By my hand, Gal replied, if Fionn were to treat me as his father did, I would treat Fionn the way I treated Fionn's father. Fionn closed his eyes and beat away the anger that was rising within him. He smiled grimly. If I were so minded, I would not let that last word go with you, Gal, for I have here 100 men for every man of yours. Gal laughed aloud. So had your father, he said. Fionn's brother, Carol Whiteskin, broke into the conversation with a harsh laugh. How many of Fionn's household has the wonderful Gal put down, he cried. But Gal's brother, bald Conan the Swearer, turned a savage eye on Carol. By my weapon, said he, there were never less than 101 men with Gal, and the least of them could have put you down easily enough. Ah, cried Carol, and are you one of the 101, old scald head? One indeed, my thick-witted, thin-livered Carol, and I undertake to prove on your hide that what my brother said was true, and that what your brother said was false. You undertake that, growled Carol, and on the word he loosed a furious buffet at Conan, which Conan returned with a fist so big that every part of Carol's face was hit with a one blow. The two then fell into grips and went lurching and punching about the great hall. Two of Oscar's sons could not bear to see their uncle being worsted, and they leaped at Conan, and two of the Gal's sons rushed at them. Then Oscar himself leaped up, and with a hammer in either hand he went battering into the melee. I thank the gods, said Conan, for the chance of killing yourself, Oscar. These two encountered then, and Oscar knocked a groan of distress out of Conan. He looked appealingly at his brother Art of Macmorna, and that powerful champion flew to his aid and wounded Oscar. Oisin, Oscar's father, could not abide that. He dashed in and quelled Artag. Then rough-hair Macmorna wounded Oisin and was himself tumbled by Mac Lugach, who was again wounded by Gara Macmorna. The banqueting hall was in tumult. In every part of it men were giving and taking blows. Here two champions with their arms round each other's necks were stamping round and round in a slow, sad dance. Here were two crouching against each other, looking for a soft place to hit. Yonder a big-shouldered person lifted another man in his arms and threw him at a small group that charged him. In a retired corner a gentleman stood in a thoughtful attitude while he tried to pull out a tooth that had been knocked loose. You can't fight, he mumbled, with a loose shoe or a loose tooth. "Hurry up with that tooth," the man in front of him grumbled, "for I want to knock out another one." Pressed against the wall was a bevy of ladies, some of whom were screaming and some laughing, and all of whom were calling on the men to go back to their seats. Only 2 people remained seated in the hall. Gaul twisted round, watching on the progress of the brawl critically, and Fionn, sitting opposite, watched Gaul. Just then Phelan, another of Fionn's sons, stormed the hall with 300 of the Fianna, and by this force all Gaul's people were put out of doors, where the fight continued. Gaul looked then calmly on Fionn. "Your people are using their weapons," said he. "Are they?" Fionn inquired as calmly and as though addressing the air. "In the matter of weapons," said Gaul, and the hard-fighting pillar of battle turned to where his arms hung on the wall behind him. He took his solid, well-balanced sword in his fist, over his left arm his ample, bossy shield, and with another side look at Fionn, he left the hall and charged irresistibly into the fray. Fionn then arose. He took his accoutrements from the wall also and strode out. Then he raised the triumphant Fenian shout and went into the combat. That was no place for a sick person to be. It was not the corner which a slender-fingered woman would choose to do up her hair, nor was it the spot an ancient man would select to think quietly in. For the tumult of sword on sword, of axe on shield, the roar of the contending parties, the crying of wounded men, and the screaming of frightened women destroyed peace, and over all was the rallying cry of Gul MacMorna and the great shout of Fionn. Then Fergus Trulips gathered about him all the poets of the Fianna, and they surrounded the combatants. They began to chant and intone long heavy rhymes and incantations until the rhythmic beating of their voices covered even the noise of war, so that the men stopped hacking and hewing and let their weapons drop from their hands. These were picked up by the poets, and a reconciliation was effected between the 2 parties. But Fionn affirmed that he would make no peace with Clan Morna until the matter had been judged by the king, Cormac mac Art, and by his daughter Ailbhe, and by his son Cairbre of Anna Life, and by Fintan, the chief poet. Gaul agreed that the affair should be submitted to that court, and a day was appointed, a fortnight from that date, to meet at Tara of the kings for judgment. Then the hall was cleansed, and the banquet recommenced. Of Fionn's people, 1,100 of men and women were dead, while of Gaul's people, 11 men and 50 women were dead. But it was through fright the women died, for not one of them had a wound, or a bruise, or a mark. The author includes this note: this version of the death of Wall is not correct. Also, Canuck is not in Lachlan, but in Ireland. End of section 45. Section 46 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Little Brawl at Allen, Chapter 3. At the end of a fortnight, Fionn and Gaul and the chief men of the Fianna attended at Tara. The king, his son and daughter, with Flavry, Fihel, and Fintan mac Bachna, sat in the place of judgment, and Cormac called on the witnesses for evidence. Fionn stood up, but the moment he did so, Gul MacMorna arose also. "I object to Fionn giving evidence," said he. "Why so?" the king asked. "Because in any matter that concerned me, Fionn would turn a lie into truth, and the truth into a lie." "I do not think that is so," said Fionn. "You see, he has already commenced it," cried Gaul. "If you object to the testimony of the chief person present, in what way are we to obtain evidence?" the king demanded. "I," said Gaul, "will trust to the evidence of Fergus Trulips. He is Fionn's poet, and will tell no lie against his master. He is a poet, and will tell no lie against anyone." "I agree to that," said Fionn. "I require, nevertheless," Gaul continued, "that Fergus should swear before the court, by his gods, that he will do justice between us." Fergus was accordingly sworn and gave his evidence. He stated that Fionn's brother Carol struck Conan MacMorna, that Gaul's 2 sons came to help Conan, that Oscar went to help Carol, And with that, Fion's people and the clan Morna rose at each other, and what had started as a brawl ended as a battle with 1,100 of Fion's people and 61 of Gal's people dead. "I marvel," said the king in a discontented voice, "that, considering the numbers against them, the losses of Clan Morna should be so small." Fionn blushed when he heard that. Fergus replied, "Gal Mac Morna covered his people with his shield. All that slaughter was done by him." "The press was too great," Fionn grumbled. "I could not get at him in time, or what?" said Gal with a great laugh. Fionn shook his head sternly and said no more. "What is your judgment?" Cormac demanded of his fellow judges. Flaherty pronounced first. "I give damages to Clan Morna." "Why?" said Cormac. "Because they were attacked first." Cormac looked at him stubbornly. "I do not agree with your judgment," he said. "What is there faulty in it?" Flaherty asked. "You have not considered," the king replied, "that a soldier owes obedience to his captain, and that given the time and the place, Fionn was the captain and Gal was only a simple soldier." Flaherty considered the king's suggestion. That, he said, would hold good for the white striking of blows or fists, but not for the red striking or sword strokes. "What is your judgment?" the king asked Fiel. Fiel then pronounced, "I hold that Clan Morna was attacked first, and that they are to be free from payment of damages." "And as regards Fionn," said Cormac, "I hold that on account of his great losses, Fionn is to be exempt from payment of damages, and that his losses are to be considered as damages." "I agree in that judgment," said Fintan. The king and his son also agreed, and the decision was imparted to the Fianna. "One must abide by a judgment," said Fionn. "Do you abide by it?" Gal demanded. "I do," said Fionn. Gal and Fionn then kissed each other, and thus peace was made. For notwithstanding the endless bicker of these two heroes, they loved each other well. Yet now that the years have gone by, I think the fault lay with Gal and not with Fionn, and that the judgment given did not consider everything. For at that table Gal should not have given greater gifts than his master and host did, and it was not right of Gal to take by force the position of greatest gift-giver of the Fianna, for there was never in the world one greater at giving gifts, or giving battle, or making poems than Fionn was. That side of the affair was not brought before the court, but perhaps it was suppressed out of delicacy for Fionn, for if Gal could be accused of ostentation, Fionn was open to the uglier charge of jealousy. It was nevertheless Gal's forward and impish temper which commenced the brawl, and the verdict of time must be to exonerate Fionn, and to let the blame go where it is merited. There is, however, this to be added and remembered, that whenever Fionn was in a tight corner, it was Gal that plucked him out of it.
Section 47 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat, Chapter 1. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Carl of the Drab Coat, Chapter 1. One day something happened to Finn, the son of Ul. That is, he departed from the world of men, and was set wandering in great distress of mind through Faerie. He had days and nights there, and adventures there, and was able to bring back the memory of these. That, by itself, is wonderful, for there are few people who remember that they have been to Faerie or aught of all that happened to them in that state. In truth, we do not go to Faerie, we become Faerie, and in the beating of a pulse we may live for a year or 1,000 years. But when we return, the memory is quickly clouded, and we seem to have had a dream or seen a vision, although we have verily been in Faerie. It was wonderful then that Finn should have remembered all that happened to him in that wide-spun moment. But in this tale there is yet more to marvel at, for not only did Finn go to Faerie, but the great army which he had marshalled to Ben Adair, the Hill of Howth, were translated also. and neither he nor they were aware that they had departed from the world until they came back to it. 14 battles, 7 of the reserve and 7 of the regular Fianna, had been taken by the chief on a great march and maneuver. When they reached Ben Adair, it was decided to pitch camp so that the troops might rest in view of the warlike plan which Finn had imagined for the morrow. The camp was chosen, and each squadron and company of the host were lodged into an appropriate place, so there was no overcrowding and no halt or interruption of the march. For where a company halted, that was its place of rest, and in that place it hindered no other company, and was at its own ease. When this was accomplished, the leaders of battalions gathered on a level, grassy plateau overlooking the sea, where a consultation began as to the next day's maneuvers, and during this discussion they looked often on the wide water that lay wrinkling and twinkling below them. A roomy ship, under great press of sail, was bearing on Ben Adair from the east. Now and again, in a lull of the discussion, a champion would look and remark on the hurrying vessel, and it may have been during one of these moments that the adventure happened to Finn and the Fianna. "Wonder where that ship comes from," said Conan idly. But no person could surmise anything about it beyond that it was a vessel well equipped for war. As the ship drew by the shore, the watchers observed a tall man swing from the side by means of his spear shafts, and in a little while this gentleman was announced to Finn, and was brought into his presence. A sturdy, bellicose, forthright personage he was indeed. He was equipped in a wonderful solidity of armor, with a hard carven helmet on his head, a splendid red-bossed shield swinging on his shoulder, a wide-grooved, straight sword clashing along his thigh. On his shoulders, under the shield, he carried a splendid scarlet mantle. Over his breast was a great brooch of burnt gold, and in his fist he gripped a pair of thick-shafted, unburnished spears. Finn and the champions looked on this gentleman, and they admired exceedingly his bearing and equipment. "Of what blood are you, young gentleman?" Finn demanded. "And from which of the far corners of the world do you come?" "My name is Cale of the Iron," the stranger answered, "and I am the son to the king of Thessaly." "What errand has brought you here?" "I do not go on errands," the man replied sternly, "but on the affairs that please me." "Be it so. What is the pleasing affair which brings you to this land?" "Since I left my own country, I have not gone from a land or an island until it paid tribute to me and acknowledged my lordship." "And you have come to this realm," cried Finn, doubting his ears. "For tribute and sovereignty," growled the other, and he struck the haft of his spear violently on the ground. "By my hand," said Conan, "we've never heard of a warrior, however great, but his peer was found in Ireland, and the funeral songs of all such have been chanted by the women of this land." "By my hand and word," said the harsh stranger, "your talk makes me think of a small boy, or of an idiot." "Take heed, sir," said Finn, "for the champions and great dragons of the Gale are standing by you, and around us there are 14 battles of the Fianna of Ireland." "If all the Fianna who have died in the last 7 years were added to all that are now here," the stranger asserted, "I would treat all of these and those grievously, and would curtail their limbs and their lives." "It is no small boast," Conan murmured, staring at him. "It is no boast at all," said Cale, "and to show my quality and standing, I will propose a deed to you." "Give out your deed," Finn commanded. "Thus," said Cale with cold savagery, "if you can find a man among your 14 battalions who can outrun or outwrestle or outfight me, I will take myself off to my own country and will trouble you no more. And so harshly did he speak, and with such a belligerent eye did he stare, that dismay began to seize on the champions, and even Finn felt that his breath had halted. "'Tis spoken like a hero," he admitted after a moment. "And if you cannot be matched on those terms, it will not be from a dearth of applicants. In running alone," Finn continued thoughtfully, "we have a notable champion, Kelt MacRonan. This son of Ronan will not long be notable," the stranger asserted. "He can outstrip the red deer," said Conan. "He can outrun the wind," cried Finn. "He will not be asked to outrun the red deer or the wind," the stranger sneered. "He will be asked to outrun me," he thundered. "Produce this runner, and we shall discover if he keeps as great heart in his feet as he has made you think." "He's not with us," Conan lamented. "These notable warriors are never with us when the call is made," said the grim stranger. "By my hand," cried Finn, "he shall be here in no great time, for I will fetch him myself." "Be it so," said Cale. "And during my absence," Finn continued, "I leave this as a compact that you make friends with the Fianna here present, and that you observe all the conditions and ceremonies of friendship." Cale agreed to that. "I will not hurt any of these people until you return," he said. Finn then set out towards Terror of the Kings, for he thought Kelt MacRonan would surely be there. "And if he's not there," said the champion to himself, "then I shall find him at Sesh Curran of the Fianna." End of Chapter 1.